Many thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video. So regardless if you're just getting started with landscape photography or you're a seasoned professional, at some point throughout your photographic journey, you have overdeveloped your landscape photos. It's just part of the learning process. We've all been there. But how long you actually spend in this over-editing phase, well, that can vary somewhat. And I think the main culprit to my own extended stay in this over-processing phase is the fact that I wasn't 100% certain as to what exactly I should be on the lookout for. So while I was preparing for this video, I went back quite a few years ago to review some of my past images in an effort to identify areas of my own editing workflow that were, I guess let's say, garishly over-processed. And I was easily able to identify 6 flagrant signs that I was over-editing my own photos. And in this video, I want to share with you what those 6 signs are, how to easily identify them, and perhaps most importantly, how to resolve them as well. And these 6 signs, these are not in any specific order whatsoever. So to jump right into it, the very first sign is something that I call detailed highlights. And this might be the most common issue that I saw when I was reviewing a lot of my photos, the second most common actually. And it's something that used to happen to me all the time because I didn't quite understand exactly how to properly expose a scene. And here's exactly what I'm talking about right here, where you have a sky that's just completely overexposed. And I think that's something that, you get really accustomed to early on when you start photography, especially outdoor photography, is that you can remove or bring back a lot of that detail in the sky just by bringing down your highlights and maybe crank them down to -100. And I used to think about that all the time when I was on location. I was like, well, just get the foreground and the midground and everything is outside of the sky. Just get all that looking good, Mark. And then when you get everything back into Lightroom, you can just bring down the highlights to -100 and that will fix the sky. And a lot of times that is the case, but what also happens rather frequently is this right here. So I have the highlights not affected at all. There is a quick edit on this image, but if I bring the highlights down to -100, yep, the sky looks much, much better. I like all the detail up through here, but the sun just looks very, very unrealistic. And as I toggle this back and forth, you can just really see exactly what that is doing to the actual sun. So there's a couple ways you can resolve that. Of course, you can actually reduce the amount of negative highlights or highlight recovery you're applying to the image. So we could take our highlight slider, maybe bring it back up here, but we're losing a lot of that nice detail up here. So let's just go back to -100. And this is a quick kind of a trick that I used to do all the time, and I think it really does help. So if we come up here to the radial filter, I'm just going to draw kind of a small little sliver, like an oval. I'm going to put it right over the sun right there. I'll hit the shortcut key O's. You can just kind of see in red the area that this is affecting. And I have the feather at 100 because I want that transition zone to be very soft and very gradual and realistic. And then I'm going to come over here and introduce quite a bit of negative dehaze right through here. And you can actually see what that's doing. That's just kind of softening up a lot of those details through there. And I'm actually going to reduce the texture a little bit because ultimately I want to kind of make the sun glow a little bit more because that's kind of what it looks like in real life. So I want to remove some of that fine detail around the sun and just kind of exaggerate the glowing aspect of it. And now I'm going to come down here to the contrast and we can kind of rock this back and forth and you can see what that does. So maybe some negative contrast, negative texture, a little bit of negative dehaze. And let's toggle this on and off. So this is before and after, before and after. So you can really see just a real quick edit exactly what that is doing to the actual detail around the sun. So that's something that you can do if you ever do encounter that and you don't want to reduce the amount of highlight recovery you're applying to your scene. You can always create that radial filter and just bring down the dehaze, or maybe bring down the contrast, bring down the texture, ultimately softening up that area around the sun and just kind of bringing back that little glowing aspect of it. Now, the next sign is something that I call dark corners. And this is something that is a pretty interesting one because I didn't really realize that it was something that I used to do all the time until I actually just went back and started to review these. I knew that it was something that I used to encounter rather frequently, but I didn't quite realize how often it did occur. And it's basically just adding too strong of a vignette to an image. And I think the trick with a vignette is subtlety. I think a vignette is supposed to be, at least in my own personal mind or eyes, is a vignette should be very subtle. It should be really almost invisible. It shouldn't jump right out at you. So when you look at a photograph and the first thing you notice is the vignette, more than likely you applied too much vignette to that photo. So if I just come over here, of course, whoops, not in detail, in the effects section, you can just bring back or just reset the amount of vignette that you are applying to an image. And I often don't use that technique anymore either, because a lot of times I don't want the same amount of vignette applied to all four corners. So maybe I'll drag a graduated filter, say over this area right through here, and you could kind of just darken down that area right through there. Or maybe you can duplicate that and just drag it over here to this side. Maybe just darken down this area right through here a little bit, and then toggle those on and off. And there's multiple different ways to apply a vignette to a photograph. You don't have to use just the actual vignette adjustment. You can use graduated filters, you can use radial filters, but I think what's most important is just to be cognizant of how much of a vignette you are applying to those photographs. And something that has really helped me is when I look at an image, if the first thing I notice is the vignette, then I should probably back it off just a little bit. Now this next sign is a big one, and it's something that I hear about all the time, it's something that I see all the time, and it's something that I really struggled with for years, and it's something that I call crunchy. And it's basically, I'm sure you can already tell exactly what crunchy means, and it's just over sharpening your photographs. And there's a ton of different ways to actually see this. So when you look at this photograph right now, it doesn't look too bad. It looks a little bit crunchy, easy for me to say. But if you zoom in here, you can really start to see just how crunchy this actually is. And kind of the telltale sign of this is looking for halos around very distinct edges, especially if you have an area of your image that is very dark, that butts up next to an area that is much brighter. So like this tree branch right through here, you can really see all of this halo right through here. So that's something that you can definitely look for. Kind of back that off through there. That's definitely going to help remove that. Of course, clarity will also increase that halo as well. And I actually I very rarely even apply any sharpening to my images now. So I've done a complete 180, 360. I've done a complete reversal as to my sharpening technique. So I was always so focused on razor sharp photographs. And I think as a beginner, it's just kind of a part of the phase as well. We become very obsessed with creating these images that are as sharp as we possibly can make it. So we crank up the sharpness in Lightroom, we crank up texture and clarity, and that's where you really start to get those halos. So watching out for those halos is something that is a real telltale sign of over sharpening an image. And I actually don't even apply hardly any sharpening at all anymore. If I do, it's just very little, and I do it to very specific areas of my image that I want to kind of draw the viewer's attention to. So watching out for crunchy photographs, over sharpened images is something that I think is super important and very common as well. Now this next sign is something I call heavy contrast. And I think contrast might be one of the most difficult things in post-processing to determine, when are you adding too much contrast? When are you adding too little contrast? And something that has really helped me is this right here. So this is an image I overdid it for the purpose of this video, but you can really tell that this image has way too much contrast in it. And something that has really helped me is when you're looking in the shadow area of your scene, if you've lost all shadow detail in the darker areas of your scene or the blacks in the scene, then more than likely you have applied too much contrast to the image. So you always, at least for me personally, I always want to have a little bit of detail in the shadows. I don't want the shadows to ever be pure black. I'm trying to keep a little bit of detail in there. So when you're making your contrast adjustments, pay attention to the shadow areas of your scene, because if you end up with shadows that look like this, more than likely you're probably adding a little bit too much contrast to the scene. So if I come up here and let's just turn this tone curve off and on, you can really see right through here. So this is with the contrast, a strong contrast curve applied, and that's without. That's with it, and that's without it. So you can see when I take that away, you can really start to see a lot more detail in there. And this image is starting to look a little bit better like that. And then I would even bring the contrast down in this region right through here, just using the actual contrast slider as well. So paying attention to the actual contrast, paying attention to the shadow areas in your scene is something that has really helped me to identify images that I've been applying too much contrast to, which, to be frank, was something that I used to do all the time. And this next one is another big culprit to me, or for me. I'm having a hard time talking to that. Is a big culprit for me as well. So much like the highlights, the detailed highlights, this next one is something that I call bright shadows or vivid shadows. And I used to get really, comfortable with my camera and the dynamic range that it had. And I loved it when I was editing a photograph, just cranking up those shadows, because I got really excited to see how much detail I could recover in those shadows. But when you remove all the shadows from your scene and you end up with an image that looks like this, that doesn't quite look too good either. It kind of has that HDR kind of a look to it, and maybe that's what you're going for, but that is not what I was going for. I just didn't really know that there was anything wrong with that. I thought that that actually looked good to remove all of the shadows basically from my image to bring back all of the detail, just like it was completely flat lighting. So, and that's exactly what I did right here, just crank the shadows all the way up. But it really, you kind of create a very flat looking image. So if I take the shadows down to around 0, that doesn't quite look good either, but just a little bit of highlight, or I'm sorry, a little bit of shadow recovery looks much, much better. But that right there, just you lose a lot of that three-dimensional quality in the rocks in the foreground when you take away all of the shadows. So shadows are meant to be dark, and I think that just being very aware of what your shadows look like and just being aware to try and keep them not as dark as possible, but to a reasonable level. So for this particular image, I think something about right there looks good. Now this final sign, and this is probably the most common that I hear about. It's something that I definitely fell victim to quite a bit when I was first getting started, and it's something that I call color overload. And I'm sure you've heard it many times. I'm sure you've experienced it many times as well, where you just get too overzealous with the saturation slider. You get a little bit too carried away in the HSL panel, and you end up with photographs that look like this. I remember this was one of the very first trips where I planned everything out, and I traveled to the destination, and I looked at the weather and when the sun was going to be setting and everything. I really planned it out, and I got pretty good conditions, and I was so excited with this sunset, and I really wanted to bring it out. And this is what I was left with right here. Had the saturation way up, but being aware of what you're doing with your colors, and it's really hard to tell when you're overdoing it. I think this is why this is probably the most common issue when you're starting to post-process your images is, a lot of times you're shooting in RAW, and when you're shooting in RAW, you need to do a lot to correct those photographs. And one of those things is, definitely adding in contrast, but also fixing those colors and bringing them back. But understanding exactly when you've gone overboard, that's a tough thing to determine sometimes. So what I like to do is, get it to a reasonable point. And I actually don't even use saturation slider anymore. I use a vibrance or something down here in the HSL section right through here. But I think perhaps the most important thing is to just set the color, the vibrance or the saturation, or however you want to apply color enhancing to your photograph. Set it how you like it and walk away. That's the best advice that I've ever heard, and it really does work. And I don't mean walk away and come back 5 minutes later. Walk away and at least come back maybe 20 minutes later, 30 minutes later, maybe the next day, and revisit that image and see if the colors still look good in your mind. And more than likely, if they were really, really overdone before, you're going to notice that now. So give your eyes some time to reset, come back and visit it, and more than likely you'll be able to tell if you've added too much color or too much saturation to the images in your photograph. So I really do hope you enjoyed this week's video. And before I do wrap it up, I do want to say a real quick thanks to the sponsor of this week's video, which is Squarespace, who I have been using for the last, 4 or 5 years for everything related to my website and e-commerce needs. Squarespace provides a dynamic and attractive online platform to create your website. You can display your photography using Squarespace's professional portfolio designs and customize the layout and look and feel of your gallery just so you can make it your own. With Squarespace's traffic overview feature, you can track trends in page visits and views to better optimize your content, and you can even grow and engage with your customers with Squarespace's email campaign tools, which will enable you to create engaging emails that match your website with your products or blog post and logo, just so your messaging remains consistent. So if you're looking to start a new website or possibly upgrade your current website, check out squarespace.com/Mark Denney for a free trial and 10% off your first purchase. So I really do hope that this week's video was helpful, something that might be able to help you out in identifying areas of your post-processing that you used to do or maybe that you're doing now that perhaps could be a little bit over-processed. And like I said at the beginning of the video, this is something that impacts all of us. At some point throughout that photographic journey, one time or another, we have overdeveloped our landscape photos. So if you did enjoy this week's video, if you could give it that thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed already, and ring the little bell notification as well, just that way you are notified next time I do upload. And as always, any questions, leave those in the comment sections below, and I guarantee I will get back in touch with you, and I will see you all next Wednesday. Bye.